Ever get that feeling like someone's, overstaying their welcome? Like way overstaying.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think we've all been there.
Right. Well, now imagine that feeling, but instead of it being like your in-laws, it's a whole regiment of soldiers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Not exactly the ideal house guest situation.
No, not at all.
And that's the kind of scenario that the founding fathers wanted to prevent when they wrote the Third Amendment.
Ah, the Third Amendment. The one about soldiers staying in your home.
The very one.
Ah,
It's often forgotten, kind of gets lost in the shuffle of the Bill of Rights.
right, right. It does seem a little, well, outdated compared to some of the others.
Yeah, you're not wrong there. But we're going to take a deep dive today into the Third Amendment, unearthing its surprisingly relevant history and exploring why it might actually be more important now than ever before.
It is fascinating how something so seemingly, from another era can still hold so much weight in our modern world.
Exactly. And we've got a ton of research here, legal analyses, historical accounts, even personal stories.
Wow, sounds like you guys have been busy.
We have. We're going to sift through all of it to uncover the truth about the Third Amendment,
Mm.
how it's been violated, ignored, and even on rare occasions upheld.
Okay, so where do we start?
Well, to really understand it, we need to travel back in time to the colonial era. Imagine living under British rule with the constant threat of soldiers showing up on your doorstep.
Demanding food and lodging.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
can see how that would get old pretty fast.
Oh, absolutely. The colonists saw this forced quartering, that's what they called it, as a direct attack on their freedom and privacy.
Makes sense.
And it was a major grievance, a major one that fueled the flames of the American Revolution.
So the founding fathers, having experienced this firsthand, they made sure to explicitly prohibit it in the Constitution.
Precisely. They added the Third Amendment to the Bill of Rights to guarantee that no American would ever be forced to house soldiers against their will.
Especially during peacetime, right?
Right. And even in times of war, they stipulated that Congress would have to pass a specific law authorizing it.
Okay, that's pretty clear cut. But I have a feeling it's not that simple, is it?
You're right about that. Because here's the thing. Despite the clear wording, the Third Amendment has a surprisingly troubled history.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Throughout American history, it has been violated, ignored, and treated like the black sheep of the Bill of Rights.
And I bet these violations often happen during times of crisis and conflict, right? Like when we would expect the government to be even more careful about protecting individual rights.
Exactly. Take, for example, the War of 1812. There was a
Mm.
guy, John Anderson, a private citizen,
Hmm.
had his home occupied by American troops.
Occupied by American troops.
Yeah. And then, get this, the British burned it down.
Oh, wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
I know, right? And even during declared wars, we see homes destroyed by troops, and there's very little legal recourse based on the Third Amendment.
It's almost like they, well, like they just ignored it completely.
It's a prime example of how, even in the face of blatant violations, the Third Amendment was just rarely invoked.
Hmm. So what about the Civil War? I mean, that must have been a whole other can of worms.
Oh, you're telling me? Quartering was rampant on both sides. Soldiers took up residence in private homes and farms, sometimes causing damage and taking property.
Well, the Civil War is an interesting case because it wasn't technically a declared war, was it? Congress never formally declared war on the Confederate States.
Right, you've got a point there.
Hmm.
So you have this kind of gray area where the Third Amendment's wartime provisions didn't quite apply, but the government was still essentially forcing citizens to house soldiers.
I see. So was anything done about that?
Well, sometimes Congress paid for damages, but get this. No legal challenges based on the Third Amendment were ever raised.
It's as if the amendment was, well, invisible.
Yeah, you could say that. Even when the government acknowledged wrongdoing and offered compensation, the legal principle enshrined in the Third Amendment, it just remained largely untested and unenforced.
Wow. So basically a pattern of disregard. And I'm guessing this pattern continued.
Oh, absolutely. Fast forward to the 20th century, World War II. The Onangan people of the Aleutian Islands were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in internment camps.
Oh, right. I remember learning about that. A terrible injustice.
It was. And to add insult to injury, their villages were then occupied by U.S. troops.
You're kidding.
Nope. A blatant violation of the Third Amendment.
It's hard to believe that something like that could happen in a country founded on, liberty and justice.
I know. But it's a stark reminder that even in a democracy, the government can, and sometimes does, overstep its bounds.
A sobering thought for sure. It's crazy, right? It seems like even in times of war, the Third Amendment's protections were rarely enforced.
Yeah, you're right about that. And it's not just war either.
Oh.
Yeah, events like the forced internment of the Anangan people during World War II,
Mm.
they show us how easily this right can be disregarded,
Even during peacetime.
especially when national security fears are kind of, brought into the mix.
Oh, I see, I see.
Yeah, but there is a glimmer of hope. Yeah, a case that finally shone a light on this forgotten amendment.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Tell me more about this glimmer of hope.
Okay, so in 1979, there's this case, Engblom v. Carey.
Engblom v. Carey.
Yeah. And it became the first and to this day the only case where the Third Amendment was seriously considered by an American court.
Wow. Okay, so Engblom v. Carey, what happened there?
All right, so picture this. New York State, 1979, prison guards go on strike.
Okay.
And the governor calls in the National Guard to, well, guard the prison.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
Seems logical. So where does the Third Amendment come in? Well, the National Guard needed somewhere to stay.
Right.
So they were housed in the prison guards' on-site housing, basically, their dorm rooms.
Okay.
When the striking guards returned, they found their rooms had been ransacked, their personal belongings damaged or missing.
Oh, that's not right.
I know.
I can see why they'd be upset.
Absolutely. And someone finally thought to connect this situation to the Third Amendment. They argued that housing the National Guard in the guards' housing without their consent was a clear violation.
So what did the court say?
Well, the case made its way to the Court of Appeals, and the court actually sided with the guards on this one.
They did.
Yeah, they made 3 key rulings. First, they acknowledged that housing soldiers in private residences without consent during peacetime qualified as quartering under the Third Amendment.
Okay, so round 1 goes to the guards. What else?
Second, the court recognized that even though those dorm rooms weren't traditional homes,
Right.
they still qualified as homes for the purpose of the Third Amendment.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is actually a really significant point because it expands the concept of home beyond just a house.
Yeah.
It suggests that any place where someone has a reasonable expectation of privacy.
Could be protected by the Third Amendment.
Exactly.
Wow, that makes you think about how this could apply in, today's world.
Right. And that brings us to the third important point the court made. They affirmed that the National Guard counts as soldiers under the Third Amendment.
So even though they're often deployed domestically, they're still subject to the same constitutional constraints.
That's a big win for the Third Amendment, right?
You would think so, but
Yeah.
there's a catch.
What's the catch?
While the court acknowledged the violation,
Okay.
they decided not to award damages to the guards or hold the government accountable.
Why? Why?
The Third Amendment was simply too obscure.
Hold on. They admitted a violation, but didn't enforce the amendment because it's not well known. That sounds like a loophole big enough to drive a tank through.
It does, doesn't it? It sets a dangerous precedent, like getting a speeding ticket and having the officer say, well, this law is so rarely enforced that I'm going to let you off this time.
Right. It doesn't exactly inspire a lot of confidence in the system.
No, not really.
So, Engblom v. Carey, while a landmark case for acknowledging the Third Amendment's validity, ultimately didn't provide any real legal teeth.
True, but it did serve as a wake-up call.
Oh. How so?
Well, after England v. Carey, government officials could no longer claim ignorance about the Third Amendment. It put them on notice.
So it was like a warning shot being fired, like, hey, we're watching you.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that awareness becomes crucial as we move into more recent events where the Third Amendment's relevance becomes even more apparent. Hurricane Katrina, for example.
Hurricane Katrina. Oh, yeah, that was devastating.
Yeah.
New Orleans underwater people, displaced chaos everywhere.
Yeah, it's a terrible
The
situation.
National Guard was called in. And wait, are you suggesting they might have violated the Third Amendment?
Well, remember, the amendment prohibits quartering in private homes without consent.
Right.
In the chaos following Hurricane Katrina, there were reports of National Guard troops taking up residence in a private golf club,
Really?
even taking clothes from the pro shop. And there were also reports of troops being housed in a nursing home, potentially displacing residents.
Oh, wow.
These accounts raise serious questions about whether the Third Amendment was violated.
Yeah, I mean, a nursing home could definitely be considered a home under the Engblom v. Carey interpretation, especially with the residents' expectations of privacy.
Precisely. And while no legal action was taken, these situations highlight how easily lines can be blurred, even with, seemingly clear constitutional protections in place.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that we can't take our rights for granted.
Yeah.
We have to be vigilant and, aware of what's going on.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a very recent example, one that you might remember vividly. The 2020 Black Lives Matter protests and the deployment of the National Guard in Washington, D.C.
Yes, 2020 year we won't soon forget nationwide protests, calls for social justice, and a very visible National Guard presence.
The deployment of the National Guard in D.C. sparked a heated debate about the role of the military in domestic law enforcement. Senator Tom Cotton even wrote a controversial op-ed calling for the use of troops to quell the protests. And the mayor of D.C., Muriel Bowser, publicly opposed the troop presence, even refusing to pay for their lodging.
So while this wasn't a direct Third Amendment case, it brought the amendment back into the public consciousness.
Right, people were discussing it on social media, debating its relevance, and questioning whether the government was overstepping its bounds. Even though no legal challenges were filed based on the Third Amendment, it still played a role in shaping public discourse and highlighting the potential dangers of unchecked military power on American soil.
It's like that warning shot we talked about earlier.
Mm.
It's a reminder that this amendment, while often overlooked, is still relevant today.
Exactly. The Third Amendment's legacy extends beyond historical quarters. It reflects a fundamental principle of American democracy, the need to balance security with individual liberty. And that balancing act is something we grapple with even today.
So we've seen how this amendment's been violated, ignored, even acknowledged by courts, but rarely enforced. We've seen how it goes way beyond soldiers in our homes, right? It touches on these big questions of government power, individual liberty. What does it all mean for us in the 21st century?
Well, what I find fascinating is this. The Third Amendment, with its kind of, old-fashioned language, it actually speaks to a really modern worry.
What's that?
The potential for, government overreach, especially in this age of all this surveillance tech and data collection.
I see what you mean, like how the government can access our data now, track our every move, listen in on conversations, all that.
Exactly. At its heart, the Third Amendment is about protecting the sanctity of our homes, our private lives, keeping the government out. But what even is home in the digital age, right?
Yeah.
Our online data, our devices, our, what do they call it, our digital footprint. Is that part of our home that deserves protection?
It's like the whole idea of home has just exploded beyond those four walls.
Exactly. And that leads to some really big questions. Does the government need a warrant to peek into our online stuff? Should we have way more control over how our personal info is gathered and used? It's these kinds of things that the Third Amendment, in its own way, is making us think about.
That's pretty mind-blowing when you put it like that. So this seemingly outdated amendment, it's actually tied to some of the most pressing issues we face today.
Absolutely. The Third Amendment's this reminder. Even in a democracy, the government's power has got to have limits. It's a check against tyranny, a safeguard.
Like a canary in a coal mine, almost. If we see the Third Amendment getting violated, or even just serious talk about it happening, that's a bad sign.
That's a great way to put it, a barometer of our freedoms.
So what can we do? How do we make sure this amendment isn't just forgotten or tossed aside?
Awareness is key. The more folks understand the Third Amendment and how it connects to our lives now, the better we can defend our rights, hold the government accountable.
Sounds like we need to dust this one off, give it a proper place in the 21st century.
I couldn't agree more. The Third Amendment, yeah, it's often overlooked, but it has a vital role to play in shaping where our democracy goes from here.
Well, folks, there you have it, a deep dive into the surprisingly relevant history of the Third Amendment. We've seen how it's been violated, ignored, even upheld, but rarely enforced. We've gone beyond just soldiers in our homes to those broader questions about privacy, technology, the balance of power. This amendment, written centuries ago, it speaks to something deep about what it means to be free in this digital age. Our rights, they're not just handed to us, they're something we have to actively protect. That's something worth thinking about, wouldn't you say?